start out by way of introduction. My name is Clarissa Ward, and I'm Chief International Correspondent at CNN. And I'm very privileged to be speaking here today in front of this really spectacular and profound piece of art by Kate here. Thank you for the invitation, and a huge thank you to St. Paul's as well for hosting this magnificent piece and for inviting me along to talk to you guys in a way that hopefully gives some context or some different perspective maybe on some of the themes and ideas that I think Kate was looking into when she developed this project. So what I really want to speak to you about today is the idea of homeland in Syria. And the word in Arabic for homeland is watan. And watan, technically, if you look it up in an Arabic dictionary, it means nation. But when you talk about watan, it's different to the idea of nation. It really is more like motherland or home or homeland. And I think in the West now, we have this idea of patriotism somehow as being a negative thing, nationalism as being a negative thing. We don't really tend to attach our sense of identity so strongly to our country, right? We like to think that we have certain ideals that bond us as humans across a broader spectrum. And that's a valid point to be made, but it's also a point that we arrive at by virtue of the fact that we've never lost our homeland. We've never lost our motherland. We've never been really separated or ripped apart from the place that gave birth to us, the people that gave birth to us, the culture that gave birth to us. And so it's a little hard for us, and when I say us, I'm using that term really loosely and generally, but speaking to this idea of privileged people in the West who are born and raised in the countries they live in and enjoy all the benefits and privileges that come with living in those countries. I first traveled to Syria in 2005, and I was 25 years old. I was living in Beirut, and I used to drive back and forth to Syria because even though Beirut was so much fun and was kind of wild and had a nightlife, I found something in Syria that I hadn't experienced in other places in the Middle East, which was this fierce, deep sense of culture, of pride, of history, and a real sense of confidence in knowing who you are and what you are as a nation, as a people, and as a culture. And I was so drawn to that because across the Middle East, I would see and visit other countries where they were sort of hiding their culture and building these huge shopping malls in a kind of pale imitation of what they thought was, idolized in the West. But in Syria, they were not interested in shopping malls. It was about beautiful old souks. It was about incredible mosques, rabbit warren sort of alleyways in the old city. And this was what set Syria apart for me in my experience of traveling all over the Middle East as a really distinct and beautiful and unique culture. And then I went and I lived in Russia for a couple of years, and I lived in China for a couple of years, and I didn't get a chance to go back to Syria until 2011, when the Arab Spring had begun. And I found a very different Syria, still the same pride, the same culture, this incredible melting pot of people of different religions, of different sects, all sort of woven together in this rich tapestry. That was still there, but it was jeopardized already because what had started out as a peaceful activist movement demanding the fall of the regime of Bashar al-Assad was quickly being met with bullets and brutality. People were dying, and people were already starting to leave their homeland. And I fell in love with this story and the people, and I became obsessed with covering this conflict and giving a voice to the people who were suffering as a result of it, because it was so hard to get into the country that they didn't really have that voice. And this is a theme you see over and over again with displaced people. They don't have a voice because people have a certain threshold for how much misery they can watch or listen to, or how many tents they can see in far-flung countries before their eyes start to glaze over. And so for me, the challenge was, how do I tell these stories in a way that it's still vibrant and it's still rich and it can be hopeful? And these are people with stories and lives and favorite colors and favorite foods. And how can we inject humanity into this story again? And in the case for me, it was about, I had to sneak through the Syrian-Turkish border, through Turkey, to get into the northern part of Syria and basically embed myself in the lives of the rebellion and the people who were rebelling against Bashar al-Assad. And other conflicts I've covered is very different. You go and you live in the hotel, and you go and you shuttle during the day and you cover the conflict and you see the bombs, and then at night you go back to your hotel and you're with the other journalists and you're kind of in your bubble again, and you can talk to your family, maybe have a beer depending on where you are, and you have that distance, you're able to decompress. In Syria, we didn't have that. We don't have that. You live with these people. There are no hotels. You're living with the people. They're risking their lives to host you. You're with them day in, day out. You're with them when they're dying. You're with them the next morning when they still serve you breakfast, even though the father of the house died the night before. You're with them when they're grieving. And this was a unique experience for me as a journalist, having covered conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan. There was always that separation. And in Syria, there wasn't that separation. You were immersed and you were part of it. And so why do I tell you this? I tell you this because it gives you a much deeper window into conflict and into suffering and into what drives people to leave their homeland. What would make someone leave watanun, right? Their motherland, their home. And you realize that no matter where people live, but particularly in Syria, and particularly when you visit a splendid city like Aleppo and you see the majesty of the architecture, of the history, of the richness of this city, why would someone leave this? And I think sometimes in the West we have a funny idea that people want to come here and they want to mooch off of our benefit system, or they want to get our healthcare or our school system. And I have to tell you, this is so warped and so far from the truth of the matter, which is that it is the darkest day of one's life when you make that decision to leave your homeland. It is the hardest decision you make, and you only make that decision when you have lost everything, when you no longer have a home, when you have essentially given up on your own life and the possibility of ever having a life again, but you're making a sacrifice for your child so that maybe your child can have some kind of a future. And I can't tell you how many times I have met Syrians who are living now in the West, in Germany, in the US, wherever they're living, and they're miserable. There's no light in their eyes anymore. They don't care that we have the NHS. They'd rather be in Aleppo, in the old souk, playing backgammon with their friends, drinking arak, eating manoshi with za'atar. They would rather be in their homeland. And they're here not out of choice, but because, at least for their children, they grow up here and they can have an education, they will become more integrated into this society and they can have a future. And to give you a sort of illustration of the extremes and the depths of the attachment to your homeland, I wanted to just tell a few stories about my time in Syria. And I went last to Aleppo really in the last few months before the regime of Bashar al-Assad took it back under their control. And so it was about 2015, and there was only one road to get into the rebel-held part of the city, and they called it the Road of Death, because basically the road was surrounded on all sides by hostile forces. So when we drove down the road, you had to drive at like 100 miles per hour. You literally just put your foot on the gas and just drove as fast as you possibly could because these cars were getting shot at and blown up and all the rest of it. And they had built, the rebels, these two sort of berms on either side of the road to try to give you a bit of cover, but with very limited effectiveness. So we drove down the so-called road of death at breakneck speed, and you get into the old part of the city, the eastern part of the city that was under rebel control. And the first thing you notice is evisceration. It's like an apocalyptic moonscape. There's no color, there's no sound, there's no voices. A lot of the buildings, you see these huge apartment buildings, and the entire facade, the front, is just not there anymore. And you could still see people's living rooms and kitchens, but there's no wall there anymore. It's just gone. And everywhere, just mountains and mountains of rubble. And we pushed deeper in, and we went into an apartment building, and there was some shelling, so we went into an apartment building to try to take cover. And we came across an apartment with a family in it. And a lot of people had left by this stage. And there was an elderly woman there called Suad. And Suad invited us to have tea with her. This is the other thing you have to understand about Syrians. They have nothing left. It's raining bombs and shells. They will still invite you in for tea. They will still show you hospitality. They will still embrace you in their culture, because this is central to this idea of watan for them and what it means to have a home and create a home and share that home, and the spirit of generosity that comes with this culture and identity. So we sat with Suad, and she's going blind, and she's lost 2 of her children in the conflict. They're older. And she has 6 grandchildren. And she's an incredibly strong woman. Physically, very frail, but spiritually incredibly strong woman. And so I asked her, we're having a conversation. I said, Suad, you know, a lot of people have left Halab now. Halab is what Syria, Aleppo is called in Arabic. I said, a lot of people have left Halab. Why are you, when are you going to leave? There's only one road in and out. The regime is going to take this road in a matter of days. It's up to you now to make the decision to leave while you still can. And I never forget it. She just looked at me and goes, why should I leave my home? And I said, because Suad, you're not going to have a home soon. You know, they're going to come, and they will take this area. And she was completely unfazed by it. She said, no, I'm not going to leave. This is my home. And I'll stay here. And I don't care if they come, they take it, they don't. I die, I don't. This is my home. This is my watan. This is where I belong. And I've seen so many examples of people like Suad. Another very good friend of mine, a Syrian-American doctor called Maher. And Maher took me on a trip around the outskirts of Aleppo in 2012. And it was hell, raining bombs, raining shells, absolute just petrifying fear, acrid bile of fear in your stomach, in your throat, all day and all night from the constant bombardment. And Maher lives in Florida in the US, but his parents were still living in Halab. So while we were there, Maher says to his parents, you're coming with me. We have to leave. You cannot stay here anymore. It's too dangerous. You have to leave. The parents objected. They said, no. He said, you gotta leave. It's just temporary for a few months, but you come to Florida with me. So Maher's parents left with him. They went to Florida, and Maher said that for days his father just sat weeks, months in his armchair in this room, glazed over eyes, staring at a television screen, staring out at a wall, dead inside, empty, soul destroyed from the experience of being ripped away from his homeland. And Maher was like, Dad, you gotta, Baba, you really have to go out. You really need to keep, go on a walk, interact with other people. And he said, son, there's nothing for me here. There's nothing for me here. This isn't my home. And eventually Maher realized, and I think it was very painful for him, that he was going to have to let his father go back to Aleppo. Because his father, as much as he loved his son, he loved his grandchildren, he would rather die in his home with dignity among the people and places and things that are familiar to him, that reared him, that are an integral part of his soul, than live like a zombie in a strange land, with a strange people and a strange language, thousands of miles away from his watan. And so he did, he went back. And, you know, you really will never find a shortage in Syria of stories like this, of people who have really waited until the absolute last minute when they had nothing left, when they lost the roof above their heads, when they lost their child, when they lost their family members, before making this seismic decision to leave their homeland. And it's so hard for us to understand what that means, to be ripped out of the womb that reared you, and the people and the places that you know, and the foods and the sights and the sounds that are so familiar, and the fact that you know the people in your neighborhood, the routines and rituals, the way the souk gets super crowded about 2 hours before iftar during Ramadan, and everyone's quickly buying their last minute food before they go home and cook to break their fast. To make a decision to leave all of that, to leave what is familiar, what is the mother, what is an integral part of your soul and who you are, whether we know it or not because we take it for granted, to leave all that in the face of an uncertain future, to leave all that to try and take a dinghy across a sea when you can't swim and your children can't swim, to go to a foreign land, to walk across a continent to a people who don't really want you there, who don't speak your language, who don't understand your culture, to become essentially invisible people. Because that is, unfortunately, despite the best intentions of so many people to welcome refugees, to give them a good life, and don't get me wrong, so much hard work has been done, and there are incredible stories of success and people thriving. But for many refugees, the overriding feeling that is so hard to escape and so hard to live with is a feeling of almost being invisible. Am I really here? Can people see me? Because I'm not part of this watan, I'm not part of this cultural experience. I'm not familiar to anyone here. Do I really, and I don't know if any of you have ever had that. I've had it occasionally when I've been traveling in a far-flung place and riding the Moscow metro on my own in my early 20s, and this desperate sense of loneliness. And looking around thinking, can people see me? Am I here? Because I'm not recognized. I'm not in my context. And so I feel completely lonely and isolated and discombobulated. And even though it's exciting and it's an opportunity, it's desperately, desperately isolating. And I think it's easy for us to forget that. And I really think it's easy to lose that in the whole political debate about immigration and refugees and security. We lose our perspective on humanity and what it means to be a person, and what it means to lose not just your leg or your child, God forbid, but to lose your homeland, to lose your very core, your sense of identity, your sense of self, everything that's familiar, everything that is dear and beautiful to you. And the problem is, and a very big part of the reason that we, I think, often deal with it or talk about it with such a sort of flippant tone or in a glib way, is that for us, we've never been challenged in that way, or very few of us have. We haven't experienced that sense of being ripped out of our own context and placed somewhere where we are now invisible, we are a nuisance, we are a headache, we are a political quagmire. We're no longer individuals. We're no longer Abu Bakr who lives, near Suqa Tayyib, and, we've lost that. We've lost that. We're a nuisance. We're a hassle. And this is so demoralizing and so degrading for people who are a proud people, who come from a rich history, who have hundreds of years of culture and history behind them. And suddenly now you're reduced to a political problem, to an invisible person, to a nuisance. And I think the importance of a work like this, just to bring it back full circle, is that this reminds us that these are people's stories. These are people's lives. These are people's homes. These are people's dreams. These are the ambitions they had as children, the things they wanted to do, the places they wanted to go. And Walter Benjamin talks about this idea of telling stories, the act of telling stories and creating a shared story is what gives our lives meaning. It's what gives our existence meaning and power. And when you strip that away, when you take away that shared story, when you disperse people and take them out of their context and turn the volume down on their story because no one wants to hear it anymore, because it's too hard and it's too painful, you take away their meaning, you take away their dignity. And I think what's so powerful about this tent, and it's so much more than a tent, is that it speaks to that exact idea. Power and meaning and shared stories, and how somehow refugees can reclaim that, reclaim their narratives, reclaim their homeland, reclaim their dignity through sharing stories, through having exchanges like this that don't just focus on the violence and the bloodshed and the difficult politics of these situations, but focus on the humanity and the beauty. And the reality is we can all understand these things if we take a minute and sit and listen and share and think and contemplate and just look and allow that voice to be heard. We have a very powerful role that we can play as listeners. And that's really all I have to say. But Kate, thank you so much for having me here today, and for creating this piece that I think for many people will serve as a way to pause for a second and reflect and think and engage with these issues in a way that doesn't only have to be reductive and sad and negative, but can also be beautiful and an exchange of culture and ideas and thinking of ways to collaborate in the future to give people back their dignity, to give them back their watan. Thank you.